At exactly 2:17 a.m., a patient pressed the call button and said something that stopped me cold. "Can you tell the other nurse thank you for staying with me?" I remember the time because I checked the monitor twice, once out of habit and once because I knew I'd been alone in that room the entire night. I didn't ask him what he meant. In the ER, you learn not to challenge patients when they're tired, medicated, or scared. You nod, you reassure, you move on. But when I stepped into the hallway, something didn't sit right. The trauma bays were quiet. The nurse's station was empty. No one had passed me. No one had entered that room after I did. I checked the assignment board. Every nurse was accounted for, including me. Over the next 6 nights, the same thing happened again and again. Patients mentioned a nurse who wasn't on the schedule. Alarms were silenced before staff arrived. 4 lines were adjusted without documentation. And every time I tried to ignore it, the activity increased. By the 7th night, I wasn't losing sleep because of exhaustion. I was losing it because whatever was moving through the ER after midnight seemed to be waiting for me to notice. And that night, I decided I would stop pretending I hadn't already seen her. Now, before we continue, I'd like to hear from you. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your country or city in the comments. I read them, and it helps this channel reach more people who appreciate grounded, story-driven experiences like this. And if you stayed until the end, consider subscribing. Stories like this take time, structure, and care to create, and subscribing lets you know when the next one goes live. Thank you for watching. Stay aware. I noticed it just after midnight, during the kind of lull that makes night shift feel heavier than the busiest trauma surge. The ER had settled into that artificial quiet, monitors humming, fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead, the smell of antiseptic lingering in the air. I was charting at the nurse's station, double-checking medication times, when a call light blinked on in room 12. I remember sighing, not out of frustration, but routine. I'd been on my feet for hours, and my eyes felt dry in that specific way that comes from staring at screens too long. When I entered the room, the patient was already calm, his call light off, his IV line neatly adjusted. He looked at me and said, "You don't have to worry, the nurse already fixed it." I smiled automatically and glanced around, expecting to see one of my coworkers just outside the curtain. The room was empty, no footsteps retreating, no badge swaying at the door. "Which nurse?" I asked, keeping my voice light. "The one from earlier," he said. "She checked the line and told me you'd be back." That by itself meant nothing. In emergency medicine, shifts overlap. Staff float in and out of rooms constantly. Patients mix faces, names, and timelines, especially late at night when pain medication and exhaustion blur perception. I reassured him, documented the IV check, and moved on. Back at the station, I scanned the assignment board out of habit. Every nurse was accounted for, no floaters, no agency staff, no one assigned to room 12 except me. I told myself what I tell new nurses during orientation. Night shift fatigue can create gaps in awareness. Your brain fills them in without asking permission. It doesn't mean anything is wrong, it means you're human. That's why we double-check charts, confirm verbal reports, and rely on protocols instead of memory alone. Still, as I returned to my charting, a strange thought settled in. Not fear, just discomfort. The IV had been adjusted correctly, the call light reset properly, no mistakes, no shortcuts. Whoever the patient thought he saw had done the job the way a trained ER nurse would. I rubbed my eyes, took a sip of cold coffee, and reminded myself to get more sleep on my next day off. Then I documented the interaction and let it go. At least, that's what I thought I did. By the second night, the incident in room 12 had already faded into the background noise of the job. That's one of the ways the ER protects you. There's always something more urgent to focus on. What pulled it back into my awareness wasn't a feeling or a sound. It was a name. I was beginning an assessment on a middle-aged woman in observation when she looked at me closely and said, "You're not the nurse I spoke to earlier." That happens more often than people think. Patients see multiple staff members in short periods, especially during night shift when care is clustered. I kept my tone even and professional. "Who are you referring to?" I asked. "She said her name was Linda." The woman described her without hesitation. About my height, brown hair pulled back neatly, calm voice, efficient. She said Linda explained the plan of care clearly, checked her IV, and told her someone else would be in shortly. Nothing about the description stood out as unusual. In fact, that was what made it uncomfortable. Linda sounded exactly like one of us. Same scrubs, same demeanor, same clinical confidence. No odd details, no exaggeration. Later that night, a second patient mentioned her. Different room, different complaint, same name, same calm, steady presence. He said Linda had silenced his monitor alarm before it escalated and reminded him to press the call light if he needed anything. By the third mention, I stopped assuming coincidence. I checked the assignment board again, slower this time. Every nurse was accounted for. No floats, no agency staff, no one named Linda on the schedule. In nursing education, we're taught not to dismiss patient reports, but also not to reinforce misunderstandings. When similar details appear across separate patients, the appropriate response is to verify staffing and environmental factors, not speculate. I asked around casually. No one recalled a Linda working that night. No one had relieved anyone unexpectedly. No one had assisted in those rooms. When I returned to the nurses' station, I noticed a change I couldn't place at first. One of the patient care notes on the whiteboard, something I distinctly remembered writing, was gone. Erased cleanly, no smudge, no explanation. I told myself I must have misremembered. Night shift fatigue can create gaps in recall, especially during repetitive tasks. That's why we rely on documentation instead of memory. Still, as I reopened the chart to confirm my notes, an uneasy thought surfaced. Someone else knew our routines well enough to blend in. And she was introducing herself by name. By the second night, I started paying closer attention to what patients said, instead of brushing it aside as confusion. That wasn't fear, it was training. In emergency medicine, repetition matters, patterns matter, and names especially matter. The first patient mentioned her casually, the way someone mentions a nurse who's already been in and out of the room a dozen times. "You're not the nurse from before," he said as I adjusted his monitor leads. I asked him who he meant, expecting a vague answer. She said her name was Linda. He went on without prompting. Linda had a calm voice. She didn't rush. She stood near the foot of the bed while she talked, hands folded, posture straight. He mentioned her uniform, too. Not strange or dirty, just old-fashioned. A cut and color I hadn't seen issued in years, but still unmistakably hospital scrubs. I nodded, documented my assessment, and moved on. Then it happened again. Different patient, different room, same name, same description, the same steady presence. One woman told me Linda had explained her test results in a way that finally made sense. Another said Linda reassured him when the hallway got loud, promising the night shift always sounded worse than it was. None of them sounded frightened. None of them were confused. Their stories didn't drift or contradict themselves. If anything, they were consistent in a way patient recollections rarely are. That was when I checked the assignment board more carefully. No Linda. I checked the staffing log next. No agency nurse. No float. No one pulled from another unit. In teaching environments, we stress verification over assumption. If a patient mentions a staff member you don't recognize, you confirm. If there's no record, you escalate appropriately. So I asked my coworkers, casually, without alarm. No one had worked with a Linda. No one had relieved a nurse unexpectedly. No one remembered seeing anyone in older-style scrubs. By the end of the shift, 4 patients had mentioned her. That's when the unease set in. Not panic, not imagination, but professional concern. Multiple independent patients describing the same caregiver usually means someone was there. But documentation matters. Badges matter. Schedules matter. As I finished charting, I caught my reflection in the darkened glass of the medication room door. For just a moment, I thought I saw someone standing behind me, upright, still, wearing scrubs that didn't match the current issue. When I turned, the hallway was empty. I reminded myself of protocol. Fatigue affects perception. That's why we rely on systems, not instincts. Still, I made a quiet decision. The next time a patient mentioned Linda, I wasn't going to dismiss it. I was going to listen. By the third night, the pattern shifted from conversations to actions, and that was harder to rationalize. Words can be misunderstood. Memories can overlap, but completed tasks leave evidence. It started with an IV pump alarm. I heard it from the nurse's station, a familiar high-pitched tone that usually means an occlusion or an empty bag. I stood up immediately, already pulling gloves from my pocket. Before I made it halfway down the hall, the alarm stopped. I paused, expecting to see another nurse step out of the room. No one did. When I entered, the IV line was patent, tubing untangled, bag replaced. The pump was reset correctly, not silenced improperly. The patient looked at me and said, "She just fixed it." I asked who he meant. "Linda," he said, like it was obvious. In nursing education, we're taught that alarm fatigue is dangerous. Silencing an alarm without correcting the issue can cause real harm. But this hadn't been silenced. It had been addressed properly, step by step, the way someone trained would do it. Later that night, I reached for a medication tray I knew I hadn't prepared yet. The syringes were already drawn up, labeled accurately, and arranged in the correct order. Not rushed, not sloppy, exactly how I would have done it myself. I double-checked the chart, my initials, the timestamps, no record of prep, no cosign, no override entry. Medication safety depends on traceability, and there was none. At some point after 3 a.m., a cardiac monitor alarm sounded from another bay. Again, it stopped before staff arrived. Again, no one claimed responsibility. This time, when I checked the room, the patient was asleep, vitals stable, lead repositioned perfectly. I didn't accuse anyone. That's not how hospitals work. Instead, I asked during shift change if someone had been helping overnight, quietly covering tasks without documenting. Everyone said no. At this point, exhaustion was no longer a sufficient explanation. Fatigue might make you forget a task. It doesn't complete one correctly in your absence. I reviewed safety protocols in my head, the ones drilled into us year after year. If you don't document it, it didn't happen. If you can't trace it, you investigate. What unsettled me wasn't the idea of someone unseen moving through the ER. It was the realization that whoever it was knew our systems well enough to work within them and leave no record behind. By the end of the shift, I stopped asking if things were being done. I started asking who was doing them and why only night shift seemed to notice. By the fourth night, I stopped relying solely on charts and alarms and started trusting something we're rarely encouraged to use in clinical settings: awareness. Not intuition in the mystical sense, but situational awareness, the kind drilled into us during emergency training. You notice movement. You track patterns. You confirm before you assume. It was just after 2 a.m. when I caught the first movement out of the corner of my eye, a shape crossing the far trauma bay, partially obscured by drawn curtains. I didn't turn right away. Peripheral vision is sensitive to motion, especially under fluorescent lighting, and fatigue can exaggerate it. That's why we're taught to look twice before reacting. When I did turn, the bay was empty. I told myself it was a shadow cast by the monitor stand or a trick of contrast as my eyes adjusted. Quiet hours amplify small things. The ER can feel cavernous when it's still, every hallway longer than it should be. But the movement happened again. Same bay, same direction. Slow and deliberate, not the darting flicker you get from light or reflection. It looked like someone walking with purpose, moving from one patient area to the next. I stood up this time and walked the length of the trauma bays, checking behind curtains, scanning for staff or environmental causes. No one was there. The floor was clear. The doors at either end hadn't opened. Later that night, I noticed it near the medication room. Just a partial silhouette passing the frosted glass, the height and posture unmistakably human. I reached the door in seconds, expecting to catch a coworker mid-task. The room was empty. In nursing education, we're taught that exhaustion can affect visual processing. The brain fills in gaps when it expects to see something familiar. That's why double-checking is critical in low-stimulation environments like night shift. But repeated visual cues in the same locations demand investigation, not dismissal. What unsettled me wasn't the movement itself. It was its consistency. Always during quiet hours. Always near active patient areas, never near exits, never rushed. I began mapping it mentally, the way you track workflow patterns. Trauma bay to trauma bay, medication room to observation, like someone making rounds. Near the end of the shift, I caught the clearest glimpse yet. Just enough to register scrubs moving past an open bay. neutral color, familiar cut. I stepped forward, heart steady but alert. "Linda?" I called out, more out of professionalism than belief. There was no response. The bay was empty again. As I returned to the nurse's station, I realized something I hadn't considered before. I wasn't seeing random movement. I was seeing someone working. And for the first time, I felt the uneasy certainty that if I wanted answers, I would have to stop waiting for her to pass by and start following where she went. By the fifth night, I stopped questioning my eyes and started checking systems. Hospitals don't rely on memory or perception alone. We rely on redundancies. When something doesn't make sense on the floor, you confirm it against data. Security cameras are part of that safety net. During a quiet stretch after 1 a.m., I noticed movement again near the trauma bays. Not enough to chase, but enough to register. This time, instead of following it down the hall, I went to the charge desk and asked casually if we could review the camera feed for that section. I framed it the way we're trained to. Quality assurance, workflow review, nothing urgent. The footage was clear. The hallway appeared exactly as I remembered it. Empty, still, light steady. No staff entering or exiting, no carts, no shadows passing through. At first, I felt relief. Visual fatigue has a way of resolving itself when confronted with evidence. Then I noticed the timestamp. There was a gap. Not static, not distortion, just missing time. The feed jumped forward several minutes without explanation, then resumed as if nothing had happened. No error message, no system alert, no logged interruption. In healthcare, time gaps are taken seriously. Whether it's medication administration, patient monitoring, or electronic records, unexplained lapses trigger review. Systems are designed to fail loudly. This one hadn't. I checked another camera angle covering the same corridor from a different perspective. Same gap, same quiet jump forward. Later that night, after another IV alarm resolved itself before staff arrival, I checked again. Another gap, different time, same location. I asked security if there had been maintenance or outages. There hadn't. The system logs were clean. No manual overrides, no recorded faults. From an educational standpoint, this is where protocols matter. When multiple systems, staff reports, patient accounts, environmental cues, and surveillance stop aligning, you don't jump to conclusions. You document, escalate, and observe. But documentation only works when there's something to document. The cameras didn't show what I was seeing. They showed nothing at all. What unsettled me wasn't that the footage failed to capture a person. It was that the gaps appeared exactly when activity should have been present. Someone or something was moving through the ER without triggering cameras, badges, or logs, yet still interacting with patients and equipment correctly. By the end of the shift, I sat longer than usual at the desk watching the live feed. The hallway stayed empty. The clock advanced normally. No gaps, almost as if whatever caused them only appeared when I was busy elsewhere. That was when I understood something important. If I wanted to see what the cameras couldn't, I would have to be present when it happened. And that meant the next night, I wouldn't be waiting behind a desk. In healthcare, we're trained to recognize when passive observation becomes a liability. If something repeats without explanation, you intervene, not emotionally, but methodically. That's what I told myself as I walked into the ER that night. I wasn't chasing a story. I was responding to an unresolved anomaly. I reviewed the previous nights in my head the way we review case timelines. The occurrences clustered during low-traffic hours. They followed patient care routes. They avoided administrative spaces. Whatever was moving through the department behaved like a nurse on rounds. Avoidance had become its own decision. Every time I dismissed a patient comment or chalked movement up to fatigue, the activity continued. Silence hadn't reduced it. If anything, it had allowed it to persist. So I made a choice. I would stop waiting for alarms to resolve themselves. I would stop turning away when I caught movement in my peripheral vision. I would walk the routes deliberately at the times the gaps usually appeared, not to confront, but to observe. Before midnight, I informed the charge nurse that I'd be doing additional rounding during quiet hours. I didn't mention names or suspicions, only that I wanted closer oversight of patient areas. It was a reasonable request. Hospitals encourage vigilance, especially on night shift. At 1:30 a.m., I left the nurse's station and began walking the trauma bays in sequence. I moved slowly, listening for footsteps that didn't match my own. I checked corners I normally passed without thought. I paused where I had seen movement before. Nothing happened. At 2 a.m., I repeated the route. Still nothing. I reminded myself of another principle we teach new staff. Increased attention changes behavior. Whether you're observing a system or a person, presence alone can alter patterns. Part of me wondered if whatever I'd been noticing would simply stop now that I was looking for it. But as I turned back toward the observation wing, I felt something shift. Not around me, but in me. A quiet certainty that I was no longer alone in this process. I wasn't chasing fatigue. I wasn't indulging fear. I was acknowledging that something in this hospital followed routines as faithfully as I did, and that if I wanted answers, I had to meet it on its own terms. That night, I didn't return to the desk. I stayed on the floor, waiting. The first sound came just after 2:20 a.m., when the ER settles into a quiet so complete that even small noises feel amplified. I was standing near the observation wing, reviewing vitals at the wall monitor, when I heard it. Footsteps. Not hurried, not heavy. The soft, controlled sound of rubber soles moving at a steady pace. I didn't turn right away. In clinical settings, we're taught to pause before reacting, especially at night. Sound can travel unpredictably through long corridors, and HVAC systems can mimic human movement. So I listened. The footsteps continued, passing an unused corridor we rarely accessed after midnight. I heard the faint rustle of fabric, too, the subtle brushing sound scrubs make when someone walks with purpose. That detail mattered. Fabric noise is irregular. Mechanical sounds aren't. I followed at a measured distance, keeping my breathing even, counting my steps the way we're trained to during stressful situations. Controlled movement keeps the mind clear. Panic narrows perception. As I reached the corridor entrance, the overhead lights flickered on automatically, triggered by motion. The hallway stretched ahead of me, clean and empty, lined with closed supply doors and one room we used only during overflow. The footsteps didn't echo. They faded. I stopped and listened again. Silence. From an educational standpoint, this is where cognitive bias becomes dangerous. Once the brain expects a sound, it will create one if you let it. That's why we confirm with evidence. Visual, spatial, procedural. I walked the length of the corridor slowly, checking door handles, scanning for airflow disturbances that might explain the noise. Nothing moved. The floor was clear. No carts, no open vents. As I turned back, I heard it again, closer this time. The soft press of shoes on tile behind me. I didn't run. I didn't call out. In healthcare, you learn quickly that sudden reactions escalate situations unnecessarily. Instead, I positioned myself near the wall, grounding my awareness in physical details. The cold surface of the counter, the hum of the lights overhead. The footsteps passed behind me, close enough that I felt the faint shift of air, like someone moving through your personal space. Then I heard a voice. Not spoken to me, spoken past me. "Vitals are stable," it said quietly, calm and professional. The voice belonged exactly where it should have, on a nurse making rounds. When I turned, the corridor was empty again. My heart rate was elevated but steady. I noted it automatically, the way nurses do. I stood there longer than necessary, replaying the sound in my mind. This wasn't exhaustion. Exhaustion blurs. This was precise. Someone had just walked the corridor with me, and the next time I knew I wouldn't just be following the sound. I would be following her. It happened just before 3 a.m., during the window when the ER feels suspended between days. I was near the trauma bays again, standing still, not pretending to chart, not moving with purpose, just present. Presence matters. In clinical observation, stillness reveals things motion hides. I heard the footsteps first, exactly as before. Soft soles, even pace. This time I didn't follow from behind. I waited. The movement passed the open bay across from me, and for the first time, it didn't stay at the edge of my vision. She stepped fully into view. She was real enough that my brain did what it's trained to do. Categorize. Adult female, average height, neutral posture, scrubs, but not the current issue. The fabric was thicker, the cut slightly different. The color faded in a way that comes from years of industrial washing, not age. Her badge was clipped correctly, but the plastic was yellowed, the name worn smooth. Linda. She stood near the foot of the bed, hands folded loosely, scanning monitors the way experienced nurses do, quick, efficient, without wasted movement. Her hair was pulled back neatly, no loose strands, no attempt at style, practical, professional. What didn't belong wasn't her appearance. It was the stillness. She didn't breathe the way living people do. No rise and fall of the chest, no micro-adjustments of balance. She was present without the constant corrections the body makes to stay upright. From an educational standpoint, the brain looks for inconsistencies under stress. That's how we catch medication errors, subtle patient decline, environmental hazards. My brain latched onto that detail immediately. She turned her head toward me. Our eyes met. There was no malice there, no warning, just acknowledgement, like I'd finally arrived on time. "You're watching now," she said. Her voice matched what the patients had described, calm, even, unhurried. It carried authority without volume. I didn't respond. In moments of shock, silence is common. The nervous system prioritizes processing over speech. She took one step toward me. No sound this time, no fabric rustle. "You don't need to follow," she said. I finished my rounds. Then she moved past me, close enough that the air shifted again and disappeared into the adjacent bay. I followed immediately. The bay was empty, monitors steady, curtains still, no gap in time, no alarm, no evidence. I stood there, heart steady but heavy, understanding something I hadn't allowed myself to before. This wasn't a haunting meant to frighten, it was a routine, and I had just crossed into it. When she vanished, the ER didn't change. That was the most unsettling part. The monitors kept humming, the lights stayed steady. A patient down the hall coughed in their sleep. The night continued as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. I stood in that trauma bay longer than I should have, checking corners that didn't need checking, watching numbers that were already stable. In healthcare, we're taught that after any high-stress event, code, near miss, unexpected outcome, you pause, assess yourself, and return to routine. Structure keeps you functional. I finished my rounds. I documented everything I could document, which in this case was very little. There is no section in the chart for encounters that don't fit existing categories. So I focused on what mattered. Patient care remained uninterrupted. No harm had occurred. All systems were operating normally. But I had changed. The rest of the shift passed without incident. No more footsteps, no unexplained alarms, no patients mentioned Linda again. It was as if acknowledging her presence had closed a loop I didn't know was open. At shift change, I gave report like I always did, clear, concise, clinical. I didn't mention what I'd seen. Not because I feared disbelief, but because some experiences require processing before sharing. In medicine, we understand that premature disclosure can distort understanding. Driving home at dawn, exhaustion finally set in, but sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept returning to details, not fear-driven, but analytical. The badge, the stillness, the way she spoke about finishing her rounds. Hospitals carry layers of history, staff turnover, outdated protocols, renamed wings. We teach new nurses to respect that history, to understand that we're temporary stewards of spaces that have seen thousands of lives pass through them. What unsettled me wasn't that I had seen something unexplainable. It was that it fit too neatly into the rhythm of care. In the weeks that followed, I requested fewer night shifts. When I did work them, I stayed more aware of the environment, not just patients, but spaces, corridors, corners, silence. I didn't see Linda again, but sometimes during quiet hours, I noticed tasks completed just a little too efficiently. Alarms resolved before escalation, patients calmer than expected. I never followed those moments. Some patterns, once understood, don't need to be confronted again. I still believe in protocols, in documentation, in evidence. But I also understand now that vigilance isn't just about what appears on monitors. It's about noticing what moves through the margins of your awareness and choosing carefully when to look.